Hello and welcome to another episode of Brave UX. I'm Brendan Jarvis, Managing Founder of The Space in Between, the home of New Zealand's only specialist evaluative UX research practice and world-class UX lab, enabling brave teams across the globe to de-risk product design and equally brave leaders to shape and scale design culture. You can find out a bit more about that at thespaceinbetween.co.nz. Here on Brave UX, though, it's my job to help you to put the pieces of the product puzzle together. I do that by unpacking the stories, learnings, and expert advice of world-class UX design and product management professionals. My guest today is Dan Hill. Dan is, well, many things: a designer, urbanist, educator, and experienced leader who has worked across multiple industries and sectors for the past 30 years. In particular, he's found his sweet spot working at the intersection of design, technology, and cities. In April, Dan became the director of the Melbourne School of Design at the University of Melbourne, Australia. There, he's working to elevate the graduate educational experience through a holistic approach to interdisciplinary design practices and learning. Dan has also held roles as a professor at the Oslo School of Architecture and Design, visiting professor of practice at UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, visiting professor at Design Academy Eindhoven, and adjunct professor at RMIT University. Prior to joining the Melbourne School of Design, Dan was the director of strategic design at Vinnova, the Swedish Government's innovation agency. He has also previously been an associate director and head of Arup Digital Studio at Arup in London, CEO of Fabrica in Italy, a strategic design lead at Citra, Finland's government's innovation fund, and the head of interactive technology and design at the BBC. Dan has developed and delivered city strategy and urban development projects for local governments in Amsterdam, Melbourne, Stockholm, Manchester, Sydney, and London, as well as for Google's parent company, Alphabet, and Lendlease. He was one of the Mayor of London's, Sadiq Khan's inaugural design advocates. He has been a trustee of the Participatory City Foundation and is a founding member of the UN Habitat Council for Urban Initiatives. Dan is the author of the influential book, Dark Matter and Trojan Horses, a strategic design vocabulary, and is a prolific blogger who has been writing about design, technology, cities, and culture for over 20 years. Definitely check out his blog. It's called City of Sound, and you can find it on Medium. Honestly, I could go on. Dan has done plenty of amazing things, but it will be much better if I don't and we find out about them from him directly. Dan, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Sorry, my CV takes like half an hour to get through. I suppose it took about 30 years for me to get through it. So,
yeah, I feel like I've got the better end of that bargain, to be fair.
Exactly.
Hey, Dan, I really enjoyed preparing for today. I watched a number of your previous talks and read some of the things that you've written. And I did notice a couple of times you referred to football, and I just want to clarify for our American audience that when we speak about football, we're talking about what they refer to as soccer.
Yes.
Just how large a football fan are you?
Pretty big, I would say, in that I'm a Liverpool fan, for what it's worth, and I probably think about them every 20 minutes, I would say. But then, because, I'm not a fan that can go to games anymore because I live on the other side of the world. Other than that, the first thing I do when I wake up in the morning is check the football news, read the Liverpool football website. This morning, the players just returned to training for the start of the new season yesterday. So, why someone like me would waste their time watching photos of 20-year-old, grown men doing training over the other side of the world. It's not even a game, it's just like running up and down in straight lines, with electrodes attached to them. So, yeah.
Well, some things just can't be explained.
That's how much of a fan I am that I do that kind of thing.
So if you're missing the subtlety of that, people, Dan's an incredibly large fan of Liverpool. Am I right or am I wrong that they're referred to as the Scousers? Is that?
Scousers is what you call people from Liverpool generally, or rather what they would call themselves.
Right.
So I don't know where that comes from, but yeah, it's kind of that's an old term for any kind of Liverpudlian. But yeah, Liverpool are one of the two big teams in Liverpool, and obviously the biggest, I would say. But yes, for our American friends, we're talking about the world game here. We're talking about the one that most countries spend a lot of time obsessing about.
Tell me, what
even
was
New Zealand a little bit. right?
Well, we try. I don't know if we actually qualified for the World Cup this time round, or maybe even last time round, but we give it our best. We give it our best.
Yeah.
What was it that got you interested in football?
I mean, I grew up in a fairly sporty household, I suppose. My mum was a tennis coach professionally. My dad was a teacher, but was also a qualified coach, I think, in football, tennis, and cricket. So we were just sort of, I was surrounded by balls of various sizes, like littering around your feet from a very early age. So I was playing a lot. And then, at the age of 7 or 8, then you start noticing you can also support it and get into it, just like kids get into any kind of hobby. But yeah, and I was okay as a footballer as well. So I think I was playing and regularly, in either a five-a-side or something up until about, let's say, 5 years ago when my knees finally gave out, not being a professional and being a man of a certain age. So yes, I found it immensely interesting. And then I do write about it a bit. I read about it because going beyond the sort of silly everydayness of being a football fan, as a thing itself, I find it like an interesting way of thinking about the world. I think it's interesting from a design point of view. It's definitely interesting from a management and leadership point of view, because if you think about it, managing a football team is a bit like designing an out of control system, as in no matter how much practice you do, and of course they practice most of the day for all of their lives, no matter, you're still at the vagaries of chance. Depends what the other team do. It depends what the weather is. There's so many impossible out of control elements that you have this really interesting interplay between something you can prepare for and have a strategy about and design for and create conditions for. And if you do those things really well, of course, you're increasing your chance of success. But at the same time, the game is so delicately balanced as a sort of design in itself that you can't control it. So I find it very useful for thinking about systems generally, which I think Donella Meadows said, you can't control systems. You can influence them, and you always are influencing them, right, by virtue of whatever actions you're taking. But I think it's very interesting, and like how you can think in those ways. And then as a manager, of course, you're then thinking about, I need a diverse set of skills in the team. I can't just have 11 strikers. That would be a terrible team. So you're talking about the different balance and the diversity that people bring to a collective act. So yeah, there's a lot in there, I think.
Many layers as well, right? Because you've got layers. You've got the on the field, the game day layer. I suppose that's the operational layer. The constraints are pretty clear. You have however many people, 11 aside, unless someone gets a card. You've got 90 minutes to play, unless there's a bit of extra time. So exactly. You've got and who's won or lost at the end of it or drawn.
Exactly.
But then, like you say, you've got the manager that's really dealing with that next layer of complexity. But Massively. You have these clear feedback loops, right? Like you know whether you've done well or not done well.
Totally, and of course now any professional team like a high level like the Premiership or the Bundesliga in Germany, those players are, the amount of data analytics going on is nuts. I mean, there's machine vision all over them. Every single movement on the pitch, they're wearing sensors during training non-stop. And so you can also talk about data-driven operations and all of those things, but quite literally. And yet, at the same time, it's a game that also makes room for kind of art and improvisation. So very, very structured and very systematic and very data-led. And then, if you think about the best players in the world, whether it's Leo Messi or Mo Salah, those are people that do things that are completely unpredictable, and that's how they succeed. So that's really instructive, I think, this balance between what you can control or take care of, perhaps it might be a better way of thinking about it, and then leaving room for unpredictability. And then the whole thing itself is also like a cultural act. And that's also interesting in my work as well. I'm usually trying to find things that are not, let's just say, operational logistic operations with a very clear financial bottom line. And your feedback loop is, did we make a profit or a loss? And it's based on very quant data about sales or widgets or whatever. But actually trying to find things that have other kinds of value that resist that easy kind of quantification. So I think that's really interesting, because you can see people when they struggle to kind of govern football or think about it as a business, it doesn't capture what's going on there. It doesn't capture why people care about it, right? And that doesn't quantify to a price mechanism in the same way, And so it's really, you can see authorities all over the world struggling with this one. How do we let this club fail because it failed as a business? Well, you can't, because that's like the soul of the town, and it's been that way for 120 years. So someone will always find a way to resurrect it, or because it's just much deeper than a business, actually. So I find that interesting in terms of both and my work around, say, libraries or museums, or more recently, like streets. How do you value these things that are kind of shared and public and civic and full of life? And they resist that kind of easy quantification, saying a street is just for traffic, or a library is failing if it doesn't get the number of people it needs through the door. And that's just not true. It depends what's going on in there. It depends what kind of value is being generated. It's a much wider conversation. So it's kind of useful in that sense as well.
This has taken an unexpected turn, but a good one. I feel like football, it could have gone anywhere, and it's gone to some really interesting territory. Thinking about our emphasis or overemphasis on the financial aspects of decision-making, that affects everything in the private side of things and the private enterprise all the way through now to our public institutions. Has this lens always been the lens that we have applied to deciding whether or not to do something? In the civic space, no, I should clarify.
It's got more intense, absolutely, in the last 30 or 40 years. I think that's probably beyond doubt. People would call that a kind of a financialisation, like a understanding that the finance aspect dominates our decision making, dominates the way we think about stuff. And I'm sitting in universities. Universities have been subject to those pressures as much as anywhere else. And you could kind of say, well, it would be, we could run Melbourne Uni just by picking the students that will pay the most fees. If you were a business, a pure business, you might well do that. But you probably understand that wouldn't be a good thing to do as a public institution like a university. We also should have a responsibility for equitable access to help people that don't have, the advantage of growing up in a certain background, that they should also be able to go to university if they're smart, if they work, or they have an opportunity or something to contribute. So we have to pull off these balancing acts in things like civic institutions, or public spaces are the same. I'd argue increasingly a huge number of things we understand are the same as that, where you're on one level you can run it as a business. So obviously a university does have cash flow, does have revenue, does have operational needs and so on. But you also have to pull out of that magical formula things that are well outside of what, if I was just being a purely market-oriented, financialized thinker, you'd say, well, I'm not interested in those people because they can't pay. And I'm interested in these students because they can pay double what these ones can pay. And that, in the end, that would, of course, not be a smart thing to do from a university point of view, generally, even as a business. It would be.
Why not? Tell me about that. Why not?
Because the reputation of the university is part of its standing in the community as well. And so you'd understand, okay, well, that university has just gone down the road. I mean, it's pretty clear that you'd have gone down the road of just running effectively as a business. But we actually, if we think about how do we value universities, then partly it is what is it doing in the city and the community, and can my kids go to it, things like that, non-quantifiable things. And then partly it's the quality of the research or the quality of the teaching. So those are things that are unrelated actually to whether you're just picking the students can happen to pay the most. So yes, I think so. In the end, that would bite you on the butt, because it'd be pretty clear that your university had gone down that road, because it's a public entity. It's not just like a business that can kind of do what it's like. And I'd argue increasingly, it's just, again, we've understood the limits of that way of thinking, that purely financial valuing, probably since about, let's just pick 1979, because that's when Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan came into power. But it's since then, there's been that kind of creeping movement across things. And so you saw things in the UK, for instance, libraries were being closed down throughout the early 2000s, 2010, 2020, fairly rapidly. And the argument was that they're not really cost effective in an age of the internet, because if you saw this very reductive view of what a library was as a place you'd go to find out something, so if it was just like a place you look information at, then of course the internet does that really well, and Wikipedia will give you an answer, right or wrong, but mainly pretty good actually. And so the lazy way of thinking about libraries would be, okay, the internet's come along, we don't need to have those expensive libraries anymore. And that's pretty much what the UK government got to, because it was part of a grander narrative from their point of view about austerity and financialization. It completely ignored that libraries all over the world during that time period were doubling the numbers of people going in, massively increasing numbers. And so what started happening in the UK was that this kind of attack on libraries didn't really come from a data-driven point of view, actually. It started from this position of, they don't seem right now, and we need austerity. So let's start closing their opening hours and not have them open the weekend and stuff like that. And then they started looking at the numbers going, fewer people are going to libraries. And it's like, well, because you bloody close the door at 3 p.m. It's sort of course, they can't get in, literally. Whereas, I was working on the State Library of Queensland at the time, and we were seeing, numbers double, because libraries were, yes, they were dealing with knowledge and information, but they were doing that as a public space in numerous ways across exhibitions and just workspaces, as well as archives, as well as precious books, as well as cinemas and coffee shops, like the whole thing as a public space and a civic space to generate knowledge in, as well as, librarians shifting their role to becoming capturing the memory of Queensland and working that through into exhibitions and so on. So all of that stuff meant that libraries' numbers were going up and up and up and up. And that means you have to then think about their value in a much broader sense. Some of that stuff, definitely, you can put a price tag on, but some of it you can't. And I think it was Robert Kennedy said, like about GDP, he said GDP captures everything except that which is important. And so we know and Bruce said that in the late 60s, right? So we know for a long time that the reasons we do things are actually probably cultural, or like, why do I like football? Or, it's why do I play football with my kids? Or why do I write? They're not actually things that make me any money at all. So it's well outside of traditional economic thinking. But that's the thing that drives most people. Why do you start cooking? Why do you run a podcast? It might come back in some way to the business at some point. But actually, of course, it's just seemed like this is my contribution I can make. And that's a really meaningful thing to do in its own terms. So we know that deep down. It's just that the way that we've run national governments in particular for the last 30, 40 years, and that which sets the frame for the way we think about the economy, and that's been, of course, reinforced in the media and various other things, has been this very financial reductive thing, which has been really, really damaging, I think. So, and I think we're just coming to the end of that time, actually, because it doesn't capture the issues around climate or social justice. You can't dig your way out of those holes just with better financial metrics. It's not going to work. So we need some other ways of thinking and acting.
Listening to you talk about the changes that happened from the 70s onwards and the challenges, I suppose, for designing for the urban environment to ensure that public and civic spaces have a role to play in the way in which we build our cities, and things that will come to soon, particularly around your views around policy formulation, energy consumption and local transportation.
Yeah.
There seems to be a distinct anti-establishment, perhaps even anti-capitalist tone or disdain that comes through. Is that a fair characterization?
It's not anti-establishment in the sense, well, it depends if it's a capital E establishment. So it would be, for instance, I work in institutions actually a lot of my life. I've worked in the private sector as well, as probably half my life, or at least half of my working life has been in, well, now I'm at a university. Previously it was the Swedish Government. Those are pretty institutional places. So, and I believe in them actually. And so I want government to be more meaningful, not less. I want it to be more useful, not less. I want it to be more engaged and participative. And that's why as a designer, I engage with it, because I believe in the idea of government. I think the way that we've enacted it, perhaps in the last 40 years again, but no doubt before that as well, has been problematic often. So I'm not trying to destroy or tear it down at all. I'm trying to sort of rebuild it from within, I suppose. Me and many, many, many others like me. And that can be very humble, just frontline sort of service improvement stuff, or it can be, deeper about what is the role of government and citizens, and how do they work together so a citizen can genuinely meaningful shape their own life and their environment and be an actor within that and really engaged and participative. And at the same time, government still exists to do what individuals can't do, which is a lot, which makes things fair and equal and so on and so on. So I generally believe in that, and then that's why I'm interested in working there. So I don't think that's anti-establishment. If anything, it's, well, I mean, like I said, maybe it is if we say, like in the British context, the establishment is people that went to Eton and happen to end up as Prime Minister, like the current one. But I'm certainly anti that, because that is not based around fairness and equity, and in no way is it making that kind of participative future that I'm imagining for government. Yeah, it's the exact opposite. But institutions, I think, have a lot of value. That's again why we designed them in the first place or invented them. Capitalism isn't something I'm against either necessarily. It depends on how you do it. It's like and there's a transition from where it goes next. That's what I'm interested in. Now, whether that transition, partly because the thing there, I suppose, is capitalism is all around us. So it's a bit like oxygen. I can't be against oxygen, right? So, and of course, it brings huge value into the world as well as a mechanism. So what I'm interested in is then, because I'm talking to you on a MacBook Pro, right? So that wouldn't exist without capitalism. So, but what I'm interested in is what are the limits of that thinking? And there's a bit like our previous conversation about the library. There's a hard limit to how far the kind of processes that build a MacBook Pro or Uber, say, they have a limit to when it comes to then trying to produce those kind of wider civic or social outcomes or environmental outcomes. So now, could capitalism kind of get you through those other ones as well? Maybe, I don't know. But either way, my starting point is it is where we are. So our transition has to be then forward into that, so that we start looking at not just the MacBook Pro end of the problem. Sorry if you heard that audio. Or the Uber end of, like the Uber interface end of the problem, but the wider impact of Uber on the city, the environment, that's also part of the design challenge from my point of view. So maybe this gets into the question you hinted at. So sorry if I'm kind of jumping ahead, but
no, don't be sorry.
From a UX point of view, which is my background originally, Uber in the interaction design sense, I could say the same about Airbnb, by the way, or Amazon, arguably. So I'm just using Uber as an example. But from an interaction, maybe a service design point of view, it's pretty bloody good. Right? It's technically well done. There's about 800 designers there in California. They've done a good job. It works, and it's pretty fluid and seamless. And we know that's partly why the whole venture works, because the internet enables a kind of set of interactions there that are overlaid onto something like a taxi. Let's just call it a taxi. That internet plus taxi equals Uber. Well, internet plus taxi plus lawyers actually equals Uber. And that's pretty good at that end of the triangle. But the other end of this triangle here is when we scale that up and say, but what's the impact of Uber on the city? Well, or Lyft or Airbnb, it increases congestion. It doesn't decrease it. And you remember the early days of Uber, I guess, when it was like, we're going to reduce traffic because people are sharing cars. It's going to get cars off the road. And of course, the exact opposite happens because the dynamics built into the system that are so good at the interaction design end, at the wider sort of urban design end, they're really problematic. Like 50% more traffic in San Francisco, that researchers found. And that's what I'm saying. There's the kind of the hard limits. It's sort of, whether it's capitalism or not, it's sort of neither here nor there, but it's from a design point of view, I'm saying all of those things are connected, and we have responsibility to understand that the decisions we're making at the interaction design end, the very focused end, the pointy end, if you like, they scale up, and because systems are connected, they have a ripple effect right through. And what's good at this end of that diagram turns out to be bad at the other end. How do we do that? And that's what I'm trying to move us towards, where we understand we have a way of designing and working up and down those scales, and a set of responsibilities there as well. And that would be what that looks like. That's really interesting for us to move towards. Whether it's capitalism or not, another question, but not really one ask an economist.
Yeah, and these terms like capitalism are really easy to throw out there, like I just did, and particularly easy to oversimplify. And you talked about taking a systems approach or a systems thinking approach to understanding problems, and you've definitely been working at problems that are at a significant scale through cities, right? These are not simple systems. So I sometimes wonder how much of, and maybe this is an unanswerable question, but how much responsibility can designers who work within the private sector bear for the outcomes of their decisions based on the perspective at which and perhaps the level at which they're operating? Are these outcomes self-evident in advance, or are there other mechanisms in our culture, in our society, that should be, keeping a watchful eye, or at least monitoring the temperature of the room, so to speak, so that when things get a little bit too hot, we have the ability to turn it down a little? Yeah,
I think it's probably the second thing you're alluding to there, as opposed to the first one. If we said the first one would be, I hold the graphic designer responsible for then the increase in traffic in San Francisco, or the interaction designer that figured out the user flow through the sign-up process that then got used by, by Uber's coders to then build the app around. It's like, those are probably too many steps removed to hold everybody accountable in that way. It wouldn't be helpful, I don't think. It's a bit like, blaming a typeface designer for what people then write. So,
yeah. It's a long bow.
It's a long bow, exactly. And also, you want you want Chris Sowersby, one of your brethren there in New Zealand, an amazing typeface designer. I want him to focus on making fantastic type and doing the research that he does about 17th century type forms and things like that. So that's great. I think what the second thing there is what you're alluding to is that, as you said, you put it quite nicely, that like, who's watching the temperature of that system when it starts to boil, or something gets out of kilter, or you can actually then see, there is a connection between that and that. Who knew? So that's where I'd say you need that. I would say there's a design intelligence you need up and down the chain there. And that's where we've kind of created artificial boundaries around things and said designers do this end of the problem. We're sort of almost actually reducing them down to the problem solving bit.
And to hands, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Hands divorced from the brain.
Exactly. And it's a bit like engineers are really good at that, by the way. Like they're pretty good at like working at that level and also figuring out a lot of the second order issues and so on. But what designers are supposed to do, I think, is also ask questions, not just, look at solving problems. And problem solving isn't unique to designing at all. In fact, we're probably not very good at it, to be honest, because I think designers are probably better at kind of creating problems, or at least finding opportunities, or like, or it could also be like this, or it could be like this. That's the instinct of the designer almost, whereas the engineer is like, forget about that. This is the best way to do it. I'm going to make this one really work and I'm going to do it really well. I'm going to go in a room and figure it out. So I think there's two very different characters there. And it's not just engineers do problem solving. My friend Jack Schultz said, like dentists do problem solving. Plumbers solve problems. They're real problem solvers. Designers don't do that.
We think we've got a monopoly on it, right?
No,
we seem to
I don't think we're anything to do with it. I mean, I think we are involved in that process. Obviously, we can find ways through it, and it helps.
Well, all of human endeavour, this is generalising here grossly, all of human endeavour has been the quest to solve problems, and many of them, sometimes with greater success than others.
See, I think that's a generalisation too far, which you did say when you said it, so to be fair. But I really think actually, what designers are doing is more like cultural invention, coming up with new things, right? Which isn't problem solving, actually. If you wanted to say that's it's kind of a cultural imagination act, actually. And so it's where I don't buy Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which I know, sort of stuck around for a lot longer than I have, so I'm going to be respectful of it. But it's not like we organize, okay, first I've got to get some food, then I've got to get some shelter, as if it's like some Bear Grylls survival nonsense. It's just not like that, actually, because he's making a bloody TV show, actually. That's what he's doing. So he's making culture and then pretending it's about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And this kind of shows it's the wrong way around. I've never thought of this Bear Grylls analogy, so it might not work. Bear with me. It came to me. No pun intended. But it's
all ears.
Exactly. It's more like people have been producing art from day one, whatever you think day one is. And in the Indigenous Australian sense, that was, of course, spiritual and cultural acts linked exactly at the same time to creating food and environment and shelter simultaneously as the same thing. And so it's only a very Western thing to separate those things out and say, okay, first we do shelter, and architecture is about shelter. And then we're going to do like our culture, and culture is about opera. And it's like, that's just nonsense. Much longer tradition of just doing them all simultaneously at the same time. Same in New Zealand, obviously, and around the world. And I think you can see that in cave paintings. Why are people spending the time doing cave paintings? Beautiful works of art, also survival guides. Also something to do whilst they were, living in a cave. It's like it's not like they figured out electricity and plumbing and then now we'll do some painting. It's just sort of, it's been a continuous process all the way through invention and problem solving. And it's a bit like with the library. Again, if you're going back to what I started, if you see the problem with the library, it's just a place to get books, clearly done. But if you see the possibility of the library as a place to create culture, then it has a value in the world, in our towns, in our cities, and so on. And it is also a digital, of course, library, physical and digital at the same time. So both of those things are kind of happening simultaneously there. And I think that goes back to what we've been talking about, I suppose. And from a design point of view, trying to hook it back into this kind of conversation about Uber, what it means is when we're looking at the world in that way, we are looking at problems, but we're not just like whack-a-moling our way through them and going, okay, Now Uber's increasing traffic. Okay, what's the answer? It's sort of change the algorithm, but it's still going to increase traffic because we want people to actually get into the vehicle. So like, oh yeah, how's that going to work? Like you can't do it. You have to step back out of that and then say, okay, there's something else around it which is interesting, and there's something around that. And then it hits public transport at some point. You say, okay, well, from a city point of view, as a designer, I'm going to look at the city's transport, and it's got public transport, it's got private transport, it's got Uber in it, it's got taxis, it's got bikes, it's got cargo bikes, it's got e-bikes, it's got walking, it's got wheelchairs, up and down the scale. And our job there is to make that system work. I don't think Uber actually should try and solve that, because at that point, that is getting into the bigger than the sum of the parts publicness of the city, the way the city works as a thing. And that's in a democracy where I'm in Melbourne, for instance, is a democracy, then that's a kind of a civic responsibility. Again, that's why we invented government, to look after the things that can't just be done by individuals or small businesses or startups. There's something much wider there. And public transport doesn't stack up if you try and run it as a business, except maybe in Japan. But Japan's a special case in almost all circumstances. But even then, it's like a public-private entity. Yeah, we know from an urban planning or an urbanism point of view, public transport is absolutely essential to making any city work. So it's outside of market mechanisms. It's fundamentally important. It means that Uber can't really do it or shouldn't really do it. They can do a bit of the transport spectrum, and you need to look at those ripple effects either side of it, and they could have value there for sure, I guess, as long as they fix a lot of other problems.
You don't sound very convinced.
Well, once you say Uber, there's like, okay, and then there's the racism and the sexism and the safety issues. Like they're not paying drivers properly and people falling asleep at the wheel. So anyway, yeah, there's a lot of issues with it, the way that they run it under those conditions. But the idea of sharing rides or making a better UX around taxis, of course. UX around taxis used to be horrible, and they've done an amazing job saying, well, of course I should be able to see where it is on a map and coming towards me and then call them and pay seamlessly. Like, oh, that's great. Thank you, Uber, for doing that stuff. It's just, then you get into some cities in the world when Uber came along, I think Seoul in South Korea, they saw that and thought, oh, well, we'll just do that as part of the public taxi service. Of course, you should have a good UX. Not hard. 20 people in a room, like we know you, Brendan, you could do that perfectly well, no doubt. So, but there's nothing technically that says that has to be run as a startup versus a chunk of government. They've both got the same conditions around the UX. So to me, that's the designer's role up and down the chain. And that's when it starts moving into areas of policy making or wider responsibility. And you need to be able to kind of move, you need to understand Uber. Ideally, you need to understand the dynamics, the interaction design, the UX, and why that's so important, so that you can then draw that up into public transport and so on and see the connections between them. Sorry, these are long answers, but these are you did start talking about capitalism and some pretty big ideas.
I've started to burn down the house with that question, haven't I?
All humans are about problem solving, you said. So I had to take some time just to unpick that carefully.
I might throw a few more of those at you before we're done, so we'll see how we go. And there was a lot in there, and you talked about seeing the possibility of the library, and you talked about framing. You also talked about, which is tightly related to the questions that we ask, of the problems that we're trying to solve and how we're approaching those problems. So it sounded also that there was some caution in there about the role at which we should allow corporations to play in our culture, particularly when that role starts to cross over to the public sphere. Mm-hmm. And you've also, in a couple of your talks that I've watched in the past, you've quoted Cedric Price's provocation. Now, Cedric Price was a British architect from 1966, and he said, technology is the answer, but what was the question? What was he really encouraging us to think deeply about?
I think it's a little, you never quite knew Cedric because he was an eccentric character, but he said things a bit like other people I find interesting that are kind of open and generative. So the way I take what he said was, I think that he would have been looking at the time around a lot of, in Britain it was called, Harold Wilson, the Prime Minister, called it the white heat of technology in the 60s. You had the motor car coming in big time, and that had been around for about 30 years, but that's when it really, really started obviously people started taking cities apart and reshaping it fundamentally around the car, as they did in Auckland and Melbourne and numerous other places. And you could also see it in construction technology. You could see it in communications technology, in mainstream TV becoming to be a thing in the mid-60s, so really properly. So he would have been, as I am now with sort of big tech, I suppose, what we now currently call big tech, just saying, well, technology is the answer, because everything humans have made, more or less, is technology. It's, the tools that we produce in order to say, I would argue again, like make culture happen or whatever it might be, or community or commerce or whatever, but those sort of things. And so technology is sort of a given. As soon as we started making, taking a bit of bone and fashioning it into a knife, we've been involved in technology. So you can't be against it. Because to be against technology would be to be against people, actually, or humans, which I think is problematic. But it's the question that's important. Again, it goes back to, so then what? So if you had taxis plus good UX, then what? And so what I'm thinking is, how does a city work? I don't know. Are you in Auckland or Wellington or like somewhere? Or,
in Auckland.
Yeah, so in Auckland, then you'd say given taxis plus UX, how's that going to help Auckland? Now, that's the kind of question there. Before you then just sort of say, well, one way of answering that question would just be to let Uber roll across it for 10 years. I would say, no, we can see that coming. My career has been about being in roughly the right place at the right time, not through great foresight, but just by having a set of, it's a bit like going back to a football analogy. If you make the run into the box 20 times in a game, one of those times the ball is going to cross from the wing out roughly at the same time that you're going to be there. You miss the other 19 times you made that run and nothing happened, right? So as long as you keep on looking and you keep on exploring, and you can see. When I was at the BBC, we could see podcasting like about 3 days after someone wrapped some XML around an MP3 file in America. Someone in my team at the BBC said, "Oh, there's this thing called podcasting." Sorry, Matt, I'm doing a bad impression of your voice, but why don't we do that? Why don't we ever go at that on Radio 4, on one of our least popular shows? And
you were like, brilliant, let's do it.
I was kind of like, Matt, I've got no idea what a podcast is. I kind of get it. You can subscribe to, we can make it so you can subscribe using XML to an audio file that will pop up automatically. That sounds kind of handy, but that's it. I mean, it's just, again, like 2 or 3 days after someone had just called it that. And I think we were the first broadcaster to do that in Europe, for sure, and maybe the second in the world, I don't know. But it was, so that's an example of making a run into the box, I suppose, in my silly football analogy. I had no idea, really, what would then happen or what might unfold, or that in 20 years' time, I'd be talking to you on our podcast, and podcasts have been massively important. You can't see that, but you can kind of see that this has the conditions of something that changes the game a bit. And I can't then make a prediction and say this is radical and it's going to mean the end of the license fee and we're going to need like 15,000 new jobs. But I can see this is worth prototyping and testing and exploring, and start small and start building it up and generate feedback loops and insight and watch it and carefully work with it. And then go big with it at some point. And you do have to talk people into it. I remember the show producers that we spoke to on that first show, it was in our time, were like, no idea what you're talking about, mate. I've got to make a show, just get out of my hair, and we're just like, just let us try it a little bit. Just let us have a little go, and it'll be fine.
Isn't that curious, though? Because this is a state broadcaster.
Yeah.
And podcasts being, essentially another vehicle for broadcast. That doesn't strike me as being that much of a long bow for them to be able to see that potential. But you're also touching on there what we've covered earlier in this conversation, which is this tension that can exist between the financialisation of the state service in this case, Absolutely. And the state service's role in creating culture, which is essentially what podcasts are a vehicle for doing.
Yeah, and technology changes the rules there, doesn't it? So like the BBC obviously is based around the idea of a licence fee paid by people in the UK to generate the thing into life. And that made sense when broadcasting was a physically more obvious thing, as in it was geographically bound by transmitter towers and how far those signals could reach. It's a lot easier, leaving aside the World Service, which is a little anomaly, but or rather a hugely important contribution to democracy, stroke, little anomaly. But it was, our radio signals did leak into northern France occasionally. It would get like annoyed people in friends saying that our radio signals were opening automatic garage doors and stuff in Normandy, which is kind of hilarious, particularly when it's coming from a French person. But it's
that was because that was on purpose, right? That's exactly. The English sense of humor, British sense of humor.
Only it was, and then but then you could kind of say, well, that's the limit of who's paying for it. That's the limit of who receives it. We don't have to think too hard about that. As soon as the podcast got out there and you started getting listeners in our time from the middle of Iowa or Auckland, of course, then the show producers started going, this is great. We've got more amazing listeners. They love listeners, obviously. That's their currency, if you like. That's the real currency, not dollars, pounds, listeners. And so I love that. But to get them to that point, you've got to bear in mind that they might have grown up in the previous age. And for them, the internet is just sort of, it's this new thing, and it's going to take all of our jobs away, and it's going to make our life harder, and it's going to mean lots of, the significance of the BBC will be diminished under the weight of people like ultimately Netflix and others and so on. They can they know that comes with this breaking wave as well. Now, what I was saying was that, so that's why we need to be involved. We need to be the first into this game because we want to be exploring it. That's part of our remit as the BBC. We've always explored new technologies. And we've also explored new kinds of culture. That goes back to 1929 or whatever. And it also helps us understand what's coming. And then we're able to then position our ideas, which is, again, what they're interested in that much richer landscape, which will emerge. And it doesn't mean we don't do radio and TV in the traditional sense. It means we're adding, and we that's much more powerful. But it is hard. I remember, I'm old enough to remember, people saying, I had in a crowded room in Sydney once, Flickr is the death of photography, someone once said to me. And people won't even know what Flickr is these days, but it still exists. But it was like a popular photo sharing app.
I remember.
Exactly.
Who bought it?
Yahoo
was it Yahoo?
Yeah, exactly. And then they sold it.
Yeah.
But it's still around. But can you imagine that? I mean, in a way, it's like saying Instagram is the death of photography. And yet, at the same time, there are probably more people taking photos than ever, I'd have thought. Almost, exponentially more numbers of photos and people.
What people aren't declaring when they say things like that is their own self-interest in preserving the status quo. Exactly.
And of course, I would say if you're a professional photographer, you will be doing fine in this age. If you're doing things if you're good at what you do, I think you'll be all right. And it's a kind of all boats rise on the tide kind of argument, which you should also always be careful about that, because I'm sure that's what, again, Airbnb and Uber would also say. I think that's when you have a civic institution involved in that. That is part of our remit to make sure that it is all boats rising on the tide, actually. That we are, training kids about images and photography, and that they have a place to make art or culture one way or another that is not just financialized but could be something else. That would be the BBC position on it. So let's use the technology. Let's go back to Cedric's point, ask the deeper questions behind it, and then start exploring and building. Same with mobility, same with energy, same whatever. Those are also cultural things as much as they're technical. So I'm trying to make this point, I suppose, that the designer who's working on the front end of the interface, you don't necessarily have to ask them to resolve all of this stuff. They can tell you a lot, because the guy, Matt Webb, who told me about the XML file is a genius, right? And he is partly a genius because he knows inside out the technical fabric of that medium, as well as creative possibilities around it. And he was involved in making. And so he's a bit like the type designer I said earlier. He's also bigger than that. You can think outside of those things. But he gives you such amazing insight by being involved in that kind of making. My job at that point was less of a maker. I did do that once, but now my job is then to think, okay, so organizationally, what does that mean? How does that change what the BBC is about? And I need to figure that out with my colleagues. Matt's also great in that conversation, FYI. But I think that's then kind of at the other end of that telescope. It's kind of saying, what's the BBC in an on-demand media age with user-generated content and pervasive media? That's a huge question. That changes what the organization is. Certainly changes that license fee conversation, because it's not about opening garage doors in Normandy anymore. It's about genuinely making the BBC relevant globally. That then changes what our remit is. It changes what the government thinks we're for. It's a political question. I mean, it all comes from that tiny little, hey, why don't we chuck an XML file around this MP3? You can get from that, one end of the telescope up to the other end of what is the BBC. It's not that many steps.
How much of the success of the BBC's transformation do you attribute to senior leadership's comfort, or at least ability to be uncomfortable with asking questions that were new and novel and led to areas of inquiry that didn't necessarily have clear answers?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, I should be clear as though I left the BBC in 2007 or so it's a long time ago now, but I was there 2001 to 2007. So kind of a formative time in those early internet ages-ish, or second wave of internet, actually. And I was one of 1,000 people there, like working in that area, and many more influential, and would have seen a lot more closely how senior leadership worked. I did work at senior leadership levels on a couple of big projects. Creative Futures was one, and one was called Beyond Broadcasting. One thing I did on those was actually did a sort of speculative design piece, it would be called now, which was made a fake copy of The Economist magazine set in 2015. We did this in 2005, so it was like a 10-year punt into the future, and just and I obsessively made it look like The Economist, because I knew that the senior leaders, they choose to read The Economist, they actually go and buy it. So it was like putting the ideas in a language that they were already drawn towards. Don't give them a PowerPoint or a Word doc, because no one really wants to open those files, right? But if you make it The Economist, they actually spend their money on that. So we translated some of the strategic thinking that my colleagues had done, and I'd done a bit, and then put that into this. I'll share it somewhere, because I think it's on the internet somewhere now.
Yeah, post it in the show notes. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was kind of interesting because there's a good example of a senior leader. There was a guy called Richard Deverill who was running children's BBC at the time, I think. And he really opened the door for that. He really went with it. I think, a lot of other people had said, what are you doing, like making a fake copy of The Economist? We just need to make a Word doc for the board to read. Can't you just do what you're told? But he completely saw the possibility in that, and was probably one proselytizing it more than I was ultimately with the board level. So very powerful individuals were like Richard, and I would say Mark Thompson, who then went on to run the New York Times, ex-BBC Director General, before him Greg Dyke to some extent, Jenny Abramsky on the radio side. These are key people and senior figures that were often from a creative background or had come up through the program making side, and then ended up being in charge one way or another. They were open and they were full of possibility, and asking very difficult questions of people like me, which you need to, because it could be true that the internet stuff is all baloney, but we had to really figure that out quite carefully in those early days. It wasn't obvious. This was post-dot-com crash, remember, where you can imagine people would have been like, yeah, well, that's over now. Let's go back to BBC version 1. But they actually triggered other things there, like BBC 2.0 was a thing in 2004 internally. And that was led by a few people. I'd say they were slightly outnumbered, as is often the case, I suppose, in any organization. There were a lot of people that hadn't come up for the program making side, that really didn't have that broader understanding of the cultural role of the BBC. So they're much more narrowly inclined towards financials and things like that. They were often blockers. And then there were people, as you said, that were a bit like the photographer I mentioned, that would just saw it as a hassle, or they saw it as the end of broadcasting and therefore the end of the BBC, not able to kind of transition their thinking into some unknown future, which is hard to do, admittedly, but they weren't really even open to say, well, we do have some practices like design that can talk about things that aren't just here yet, but can begin to put together a set of visions or ideas around that you can kick the tires on. That's the cultural invention role of design that I was talking about earlier.
You've used the word possibility again several times. It's almost as if what you're articulating is a tension that can exist within organizations, and again, potentially generalizing here, between people who see that possibility and people who are more conservatively minded and for whatever reason aren't able to or are not comfortable with lifting their gaze just a little bit higher and staring out of the window and pondering and wondering what things could be like.
Yeah, I think that's very common. And to be clear as well, the handbrake is also a handy tool in a car. So, if you just have the accelerator pedal, obviously it would be a disaster. Maybe that's what Uber is. But it's just, it's like you need also that kind of friction, because those people are asking smart questions. It's just that, they might just not be as positive about the other thing. And there might be some good reasons for that, right? So that's fair enough. And so again, it's a bit like my football analogy. If you just had like 11 Mo Salahs, 11 centre forwards, it wouldn't be very handy. You also need a defender. So you need that person that's going to ask the difficult questions, and sometimes you probably need a bit of the intransigent folk. And in transition theory, there's this sort of regime actors and these sort of niche or emergent actors, and they both exist in any large organization or small organization, whatever it might be, or a culture more broadly, or a sector. So you might see the regime who's currently in charge, and that's just, I don't know, I'll pick cars again, current car manufacturers. And then you see some niches emerging around that, obviously. And those niches are everything from alternatives to the car completely, like e-bikes and cargo bikes, to car sharing, different ways of making cars happen without you having to own a private car. I suppose electric vehicles, if we're just talking transmission, they're a niche. And over time, the niche becomes a regime and the regime falls away. But some actors can jump from regime to niche. They're interesting. So, because you want the link between the existing capability and the capacity, and they've probably also got all the capital, remember, and the new world, which is also emerging alongside. And so this is what's called a transition theory. It's not a revolution where there's just like, okay, that lot's all dead. Now this lot's alive. But it's actually a transition from one state to another. Some people do fall away and they just retire, or it's fine. They just go out of business, also fine, I guess. And then this niche emerges, and then of course it at some point will be challenged by a new niche that's beginning to emerge. So within organizations, it's like that too. And I suppose I'm always trying to balance my own, I suppose, instincts to be in the niches and find these kind of, okay, this is the emerging area, this is the new thing that's coming, and I'm drawn towards that, and I'm quite good at starting things up, I guess. But I really also recognize the value in people that can maintain. And my teams at the BBC, I suppose my teams at Arup as well, have gone through those kinds of phases where my first team at the BBC was very much starting things up. We're building a whole bunch of new stuff here. Second team was more like, this is then continuing and spreading, which was a different instinct and a different culture. And I think probably around that time, I also felt I can probably move on here, actually, because my work is done in this first phase, like getting it going, putting something in place, then shifting that first thing into this second mode, which is then now rolling. I'm probably less useful at this point. I think in Sweden, I just sort of hit that mode as well after 3.5 years there, setting up the projects I did. They're just rolling now. And that's great. I'm really happy that they roll and spread, and they kind of relationally spread sideways. I don't need to do those sort of hard yards in the early days. There's other hard yards to do now for other people.
Yeah. It's almost like there's a different type or nature of the work that's being done, and also a different cadence or type of person that suits a different cadence of change. Safe pair of hands to roll it out, but it's not necessarily the same person to conceive of it. Now, you talked about you talked about hard questions, and well, I'm thinking that this might be a hard question, but I'll soon find out once I ask you of it, which is that there is this tension in our cities as we are starting to remove things like lanes for cars, replace them with cycle lanes, adding in transit lanes for buses, putting in more green space in what was, high street back in the day, and, implementing congestion charges, this sort of change that is happening to our cities. And as a result, what we're seeing is a reduction in car parking. And you've talked about the job of the city is to look at transport as a whole and not necessarily just through the lens of, say, one particular mode or player. But there is a perception that the changes to the cities are being driven by a select group of unelected elite ideologues who are really seeking to serve the needs of a privileged few. Do people have reason to believe this? Do they have a real reason to be grumpy about the removal of car parking and the implementation of things like bus lanes and cycle lanes?
I guess it's a complex question the way you framed it, because it depends on, do you think people should be grumpy if they were told one thing very, very strongly and then they were told another thing? Are they... Over time. Are they allowed to be, exactly. Are they allowed to be grumpy in that instance? And I guess I would say, they probably are allowed, because imagine if, I don't know, it's one of your kids, or if you've got kids, or it's a colleague or whatever, you said, okay, this is 100% the way we're going. And then at some point you go, actually, that was a bit wrong, and we're going to have to go the other way now.
Yeah.
And then someone might,
sorry about that.
So that exactly, bugger. So that then depends on the way you do it, I guess, the way you have that conversation. Like if you're, again, with your colleague or your kids or your family members, and you're saying, I'm all about this, I'm really strident about it, and then now I'm equally stridently in this direction, then immediately someone will be like, hang on a minute, what are you doing? You've just gone 180. You're like, what do you believe? And, what's right? And why should I go with you? Because if you're saying it was all like this a minute ago, I think that's all we've done here. I say all we've done because that is a big, complex thing for us to unpick now. But, cities for 2 generations ago didn't really have cars in them. Not that long ago, maybe 3, but it's really 1930s onwards, right? So, my dad was born in 1938, so he's 1 generation ahead of me. So let's argue 2, I don't know. But, it's kind of that. Whereas streets in places, well, in the West anyway, I'll just talk about the West, that's where I grew up. They've been around for hundreds of years, multiple generations without cars. So
I visited Farnham when I was in the UK briefly. And just to give people some context, if they haven't strolled a European street before, or a British street in this case, the cobbles on the streets have been trod on so many times that you can see the collective grooves that a thousand years of history represent. And there's something absolutely intangible, beautiful, and priceless in seeing the residual effect of lives being lived in an urban environment.
No, it's beautifully put, and it has that story to it, and that story is all around us. In the non-Western world, or the South or the East. I mean, obviously, we've also had streets for a very long time. You go to Kyoto, or if the British hadn't destroyed them all, there would have been equivalent in Australia and New Zealand. Not as we understand them now, but absolutely, obviously, communities coming together in places at scale, thousands of people coming together with thoroughfares through them. I mean, so that's what humans have done for a long time, obviously. So what I'm getting at, the last generation, maybe 2, we've taken all that aside and said we're going to take those places, which were previously places of exchange and conversation and culture and conviviality and kids playing and, as well as commerce and moving horses through it, all kinds of stuff. Look at any film of a city from 1920 and you'll see what it was like. Really beautiful, kind of what Jane Jacobs called the ballet of the street unfolding in front of you. And then for 2 generations, we said, no, okay, now it's all about traffic. And we're just going to slide all of that out of the way. And we're going to make it built around the car instead. And the car's the main thing. And we're going to put traffic engineers in charge of that. So it's super reductive. So that's what we told people at scale, and we repeatedly hammered that into people's heads by massive infrastructure programs, road building at enormous scale, adverts, every bit of media you can imagine, TV, like newspapers, just the whole lot, all creating that vision. And so that's what I'm getting at. We have done that, and now we have to go the other way. So how we do that is the question for me, not whether it's fair or not, or it's just actually, it's more just if we go the other way. Actually, we want to talk about social equity and so on. It's many more people will find it more affordable, healthier, the environment will be better. The outcomes for everybody are going to be much better if we go the other way. So we have to get through that transition somehow. And that's the tricky thing. Like, how do we do that? It's not whether we do it or not. We don't really have an option, actually, because what you can see, like right now in Australia, New South Wales is basically underwater at this point as a result of the kind of mechanism in that plan A. So we have to go to this plan B somehow. And those floods and fires, as you know, they don't really care who they burn down or flood. It's just,
the constraints of change. Equally. Right. Yeah. There's also a degree of trust, though, that you're asking for, and you and your contemporaries are asking for here from the public to believe that, and I'm not going to call it a siren song, but you're alleging that the previous generations of planners, for lack of a better word, of our urban environments were selling a siren song, maybe without full knowledge of what its consequences would be for the planet. And you've talked about the other way. We need to go the other way now. So there is a degree of trust that's being asked for. And you've said something that's really interesting in one of your talks, probably you've echoed it many times, and I'll just quote you here. You said, we don't make cities in order to make buildings. We don't make cities to make infrastructure. We don't make cities to make traffic. We don't make cities to make data. So in terms of addressing that trust aspect of what I was touching upon there, why do we make cities?
I would say culture. At the end of the day, again, I know that sort of goes back to my person in a cave painting. But I think what humans make is culture at the end of the day. And we wrap mechanisms around that to enable it, like businesses or art galleries, but I think that's what we're doing often. We use technology to do that. That's the tools that we make to produce culture. And culture, to be clear, it's a complex word. It's one of the most complex words, but I mean it in a couple of senses. One is the act of definitely making culture. So you making a podcast, it's kind of, Brian, I think once said, art is everything that we don't have to do. So you don't have to make this podcast, right? But, you want to. And so it's great that you do. But that's a drive within you to do this one way or another. Numerous reasons why, no doubt. Same with someone doing painting or whatever. So there's that end of culture. And the other end is culture as in the way we live and work together, our everyday culture, the culture of a community and so on. So that's what I mean when I say culture. And both of those, and they're kind of glued together, I think, actually. And again, particularly if you go back to sort of back or forward to indigenous thinking around this, it's kind of the same thing. The art that you make is based on the community that you are and vice versa. So I think that's what people do generally. So that applies to cities. We make cities to come together because it's a really good way of making culture. It's kind of a mechanism for that. It also makes business. It makes lots of other things as well. So it makes community. It makes conviviality. It brings people together. Those are the reasons we make cities. The other stuff that you listed in my quote, there are the enablers of those things. A bit like the technology, I would say. Building is a technology that enables us to make community or culture or commerce. So if you want to have a business, you probably need a building of some kind. You might want multiple buildings, right? But you don't make the business to make the building, usually. You make the business to make the business, which is, again, the broader sense I'm talking about. And you need electricity, you might need some water, and so on and so on and so on. But you probably need some mobility to get, to enable things to happen one way or another, either to get to the building or to whatever it might be, or to get your thing out of the building. Again, but that's not the point of the business. It's not why you started a podcast, right? So, going back to that, the accident I think we made was you took this super technical reductive view and we put a little bit the plumbers in charge of the enterprise. And I don't mean to be denigrating about plumbers because, as you heard me say earlier, they actually solve problems.
Just try going a week without a toilet and you'll know all about the value of a plumber. Exactly.
So this is the funny thing. Infrastructure is fundamentally important, but it's not the point. Mm-hmm. The point is the other stuff, the culture. The infrastructure is 100% important. And so we have to find this kind of weird balancing act. So the mistake we made was to probably, if I just put it simply, we let traffic engineers run the streets. And I'd argue the streets are our key public spaces. And a public space is more than just, has it got 1,000 cars per hour going down it without killing anybody, which is sort of variables traffic engineers look at. So in another quote, I said, if you put gardeners in charge of the street, you get gardens, right? You put traffic engineers in charge of the street, you get traffic. It's like the clue is in the name. You put plumbers in charge of the street, you get really good waterworks.
I think what you're getting at here is you're not really advocating for city planners or gardeners or plumbers to be in charge. You're more encouraging us to think about, well, what do we actually want from our streets?
Exactly. So if you step back to that Cedric Price question, what is a street? What is a street? Like I said, what is a library? What is a phone? I worked on a project where we looked at just what a phone is. Very interesting. So that kind of phone-ness, I used to call it, or library-ness, or street-ness. Like, what is it that makes it a street? And I'd say it's a street. We're talking about a public space. It's different to a road. It's different to a freeway. The street is a place where we come together, and it's got a bunch of jobs to do, for sure. But they're an interesting, diverse bunch of jobs. So as a result, you need an interesting, diverse bunch of people in charge of what that is. It can't just be one discipline. And so the previous era, let's say 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, that golden age of road building was because we kind of put one discipline in charge of something which is actually incredibly complex and diverse. So as a result, it goes wrong. As a result, we get people then annoyed. And so the way forward isn't for me, okay, just find the much smarter person and do exactly the same process. That would be like a most smart city projects, for instance, is a bad example of what to do. It's actually to then say, well, we have to then figure it out as a community of stakeholders and people and owners locally, like the people who live in the street, work in the street, play in the street, and supported by expertise, but a diverse group of experts. We can then figure out what the next steps are. So I don't want to do a drawing of what I think a future street looks like. I could do, but it's like, it doesn't really matter. It's just my thought. What's important is how that street itself evolves into the future in this more diverse way, and who we bring around that discussion. And that's incredibly interesting and rich, and I think optimistic, because then it's not me telling you that your car is bad and you should be riding a bike, even though I secretly think that. It's like, it doesn't help. It's got to be you coming forward with your car and your bike and with your mates and your neighbors, and then supported by people like me and others, but a very diverse crew, people the opposite of me as well, hopefully. And together we can figure out what the way, that would be markedly different to how it's done in the previous kind of plan A mode.
Dan, I'm captivated by the possibility of that approach. I'm also mindful of time, and
yes,
while we could wax lyrical about what sounds like a very Star Trek, The Next Generation future, and I ideally hope we get there, we probably should bring things down to a close. So, Dan, thank you so much. I have really enjoyed this conversation. It's been challenging, but in a really good way. And I just want to say thank you for taking the time to share your stories and insights with me today.
No, thanks, Brendan. I really enjoyed it. I'm sorry if I rattled on a bit, but you gave such good, big questions that it was really nice to talk to you about them all. And it always helps me process my own thinking about it when people ask good questions like that. So thank you.
Oh, you're most welcome, and definitely could have got another 90 minutes for sure.
I know, exactly. Extra time.
Hey, Dan, if people want to find out more about you and all the wonderful work that you've put out into the world, what's the best way for them to do that?
Oh, if you Google Dan Hill, City of Sound, you'll find numerous ways into
Perfect.
one way or other. So try that.
All right. Thanks, Dan. And to everyone who's tuned in, it's been great having you here as well. Everything we've covered will be in the show notes, including where you can find Dan, City of Sound, and all the other great things we've spoken about. If you've enjoyed the show and you want to find more great conversations like this with world-class leaders in UX design and product management, don't forget to leave a review, subscribe to the show, and also pass it along to someone else who would enjoy these conversations about design at depth. If you want to reach out to me, you can find me on LinkedIn. Just search for Brendan Jarvis, or you can find a link to my profile at the bottom of the show notes as well on YouTube, or just head on over to thespaceinbetween.co.nz. That's thespaceinbetween.co.nz. And until next time, keep being brave.